I'm Duane Hulbert, and welcome to Learn and Love Music. Today we're going to look at composers from Russia. 3 composers, Balakirev, Medtner, and Scriabin. They're marvelous composers you probably have never heard of before, but the music is beautiful and it's very evocative of Russia and Russian culture and music. Before we begin though, I want to encourage all of you to subscribe to this channel. It's important to me, and also it's free. So let's begin with our Russian adventure. So let's look at some music by Nikolai Medtner. He was a romantic composer. He was born in 1880 and he lived up until 1951. And most of his music was very lyrical, very beautiful. A lot of the other Russian composers, such as Shostakovich and Prokofiev, wrote in a much more dissonant style, but Medtner sort of refused to give in to that. He wanted to always be lyrical in his writing. And maybe that's the reason why he wasn't that well known in the middle of the 20th century. So let's look at a little bit of this piece. This piece that I'm playing is called Fairy Tales. Medtner loves stories, and he wrote a lot of pieces based on stories and fairy tales. And he lets you use your imagination when you listen to this music. So I'm going to use my imagination as I share this music with you. This piece, this is from Opus 51, number 3. It's a beautiful piece marked Allegretto tranquillo y grazioso, sort of moderately fast, tranquil and graceful. Medtner is here out on a little bit of a stroll and a walk. And I know, a lot of times you're out on a walk and you just enjoy the beauty of the day and you just want to hop and skip. And what Medtner does here, he plays a beautiful melody, but in the middle of the melody, he just hops up in the air. So listen to this opening. Skip. And he follows that by music where you're going to continue walking. And he's back to skipping. Then walking. Then walking. Then suddenly, let's run a little bit. And we reach a cadence there. Now, this is something that I've just made up in my own mind, but you can hear really clearly what Medtner is trying to do here. Very lyrical, very beautiful playing, very beautiful music. And later on in this piece, well, actually all the way through the piece, you will hear those 2 motives go back and forth. Medtner he loved structure in music, and part of structure is making sure you can hear all of the themes. Those themes are going to be repeated over and over and over again. It's a great piece of music, and I'm going to play a little bit more of it, and you'll note that the skipping part now goes into the left hand. So here is and this part is marked allegro non troppo, but a little bit faster. So here you'll hear along with the traveling music. Here it is. Here's the next section. The walking music. Walking. It's really almost obvious what he's trying to say in this music. And that's what I love about this music. And he loves that sort of these 2 different ideas that blend together. If you stay tuned to this channel, at the end, I'm going to play this entire fairy tale. It's only about 3.5 or 4 minutes long. So make sure you catch the end of it when I'll play through all of it. Mily Balakirev was a Russian composer who lived he was born around 1840, and he was in the Russian school of composers, sort of a group of composers. He was one of the pioneers. He came long before, composers like Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff, and even he's probably about the same age as Tchaikovsky. He was the first. Tchaikovsky would have been about the same age as Balakirev. Balakirev was a little bit different than Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky lived in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and he lived in the big cities. But one of the things that Balakirev liked to do, even though he lived in St. Petersburg, he would travel to the Caucasus region of southwestern Russia. This would be Georgia, Azerbaijan. There's many different countries, and they have a different ethnic makeup than the people who live in Moscow and in the parts of Russia. Those are more Russian. These people have more of a sort of a Middle Eastern type of background in their families and their heredity, and it comes out in their music too. A lot of the folk music from Russia came from that area around the Caucasus Mountains. So what Balakirev loved to do is he would go to people's homes down in this area in the summer on his vacation, and he would listen to folk musicians play. In fact, he had a friend who was a violinist, and he played this kind of weird violin that had a lot of strange tunings and everything. And it almost had an exotic kind of sound to it. And this piece that I'm going to play is called Islamey. And Islamey is this little tune that this violinist played when he was on a vacation. And what Balakirev does is he creates these scales. And it almost has that kind of it sounds a little bit like a snake charmer kind of music. I mean, half steps and whole steps coming in odd places. But what Balakirev did is he made it into a fantasy orientale, or a kind of an exotic fantasy called Islamey, based on this tune. And the tune is pretty simple. What Balakirev does is he puts so much technique into this piece that it makes it a showpiece for pianists. So not only do we hear that very exotic melody, we hear it played fast, almost as if someone's dancing very, very quickly. And this is one of the most technically difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. So even though the music gets to be pretty dense and a lot of things going on, you still will be able to hear that little melody sort of wind its way through the music. So let me play the first couple pages of Islamey by Balakirev. So that's just the beginning of that piece. You'll note too that there's another little theme that came in about halfway through that spot, and it sounds like this. And sometimes when I learn a piece, I use my imagination, trying to figure out what the composer wants there. And I found this to be that's the theme of the little violinist playing, but this part is very quiet and kind of flowing, And I imagined that a window was open in his house in Azerbaijan or in that area, and that dry wind came in through the window. It's sort of almost like a desert wind. They even grew oranges in this area, if you could believe it. They used to send oranges up to Moscow from that area. It's sort of hot and dry, kind of like the Arizona desert. But I think of this as like a wind, a warm wind coming in through the window. And one of the things that I do to make that happen is make that kind of sound is it has to have some movement in it. And if I didn't use pedal, it would sound like this. Sound kind of choppy. But what I do is I add the pedal to add sort of the blowing wind. So it makes it very exotic sounding. Now Balakirev in his Islamey, just like other composers, wrote in what we call an ABA form. What that means is we have an A section, which was that part, and then in the middle section he goes into a completely different key. The first key, the first part that I played is in the key of D flat. So when he gets to the end of that section, he plays this big chord. Then he plays another D flat. And notice what happens as we make this, we call this a transition. We're in a completely different key now. We're in D major, and this is the slow theme. Lyrical. Exotic chords. Here's that exotic chord again. Then he writes poco scherzando, which means move it a little bit. Again to that big theme. This is marvelous music. It has this, evokes this image of beauty, a beauty that's different than St. Petersburg or Moscow. It's the Caucasus region of Western Russia. Next, we're going to look at the music of Alexander Scriabin. This is a very early work. This is a piece he wrote while he was in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Very early. It's a beautiful piece, and it's very lyrical, and it's a little different than the pieces you probably know, if any musicians know the later works. He got rather complicated and complex and almost a little harder to understand. But this piece of music is really lovely. It's called an etude, which is a little misleading because it is a slow piece. So even Chopin, who wrote a lot of etudes, he used the idea Etude, which actually means study in French. The idea is it's a study not in fast fingers, but it's a study in beautiful lyrical playing. And just like the Medtner piece, Scriabin brings out this really marvelous sense of a rising line in this piece. You'll hear these themes that just go up. And then he goes up even higher. And you think he's done, and he keeps going up. Then he goes down. But the real genius of Scriabin is that he adds these wonderful harmonies and lines underneath these rising lines. So let's listen to the opening of the Etude, Opus 2, number 1. And remember, this is a piece written by a young man who was only about 17 years old. And these rising lines just continue all the way through this piece. It's a rather short piece. It's really quite lovely. And since it's such a short piece, I think what I'm going to do is just play through the whole piece for you. It's only a couple minutes long. And as you listen to it, I want you to listen to one other thing. He's going to be changing keys. So as I go through this piece, I get to a spot where the music is in the particular key. He changes keys. And suddenly at this point, he goes into a major key. He marks piano and then even pianissimo. And in that spot, you'll hear a much more joyful, kind of quiet, joyful music. And that's where he goes from C sharp minor to E flat major. And it's really quite an interesting change. So enjoy this entire Etude Opus 2 number 1 by Alexander Scriabin. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Learn and Love Music with the music of Russian composers. Hope you've learned a little bit about those composers. I want to encourage all of you to subscribe though, and remember, it's free. I hope to see you next time. And don't forget, after I finish this part of the program, stay tuned for a complete performance of that Medtner fairy tale. A really beautiful Russian piece, full of melodies, full of joy and musical excitement. So I hope you can listen to that too. Hope to see you next time.